Psychedelics are not going to be federally legal for a while. And even then, even like MDMA and psilocybin are both fast tracked by the FDA to become approved medications and assisted psychotherapy. But, the accessibility is a question, and there's all sorts of considerations about bringing these to market in a fair and equitable, accessible way. So that's one thing. Another thing that I really want to say about the psychedelic movement and where it's going is it's just like culturally, I really hope that people make this not really about psychedelics, meaning to say that they talk about like mainstreaming psychedelics, which is great, except for that, like, why should this? I think the mainstream should become more psychedelic rather than the opposite. Like, we don't need to sort of squeeze psychedelics into these like you know, systems that haven't been working and are the reasons why people are seeking out alternative therapies. And I think to try to make psychedelics accommodate these broken systems is just so not the point.
Welcome to episode 83 of People Are the Answer. I truly believe that people are the only answer to the world's many problems. I'm Jeffrey M. Zucker, a serial entrepreneur, here to learn how innovators are creating outsized, transformational social impact and to shine a light on all the good happening in a world often hyper-focused on the negative. Today's episode features Madison Margolin, a writer, journalist, editor, consultant, educator, and guide to all things Jewish psychedelic. She has written for Rolling Stone, Playboy, High Times, Bon Appetit, LA Weekly, Motherboard, The Village Voice, Times of Israel, The Forward, Vice, and many other publications. Her new book is out now, Exile and Ecstasy, Growing Up with Ram Dass and Coming of Age in the Jewish Psychedelic Underground. Madison and I discuss her Hindu-influenced Jewish upbringing, how she became a journalist, the important role psychedelics have played in her life in Judaism, her living part-time in Israel and being there during the start of the current war, her book, and much more. Here's Madison Margolin on People Are the Answer. Madison, thank you so much for joining me on People Are the Answer.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, definitely. I've been excited to get you on the show and excited to share your story with the audience. It'd be great if you could just start off by telling our listeners who you are, where you're based, and what your current role is.
Yeah, my name is Madison Margolin. I'm a journalist. I'm based between New York and Israel. And yeah, my role, like I said, as a journalist, I specifically cover Judaism and psychedelics. I just came out with a book called Exile and Ecstasy, and it's about my experience growing up in the Ram Dass community and exploring the Jewish psychedelic underground. I'm also a contributing editor at Ayin Press, which is a Jewish publishing studio, and um, yeah, I do a lot of journalism for a lot of different outlets. I co-founded a magazine called Double Blind. I write here and there for Rolling Stone, Vice, Playboy, High Times, and yeah, just do a lot of different things. Teach courses sometimes, and yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. It sounds like you're up to a lot of interesting things, and in life in general, what would you say motivates you?
Yeah, I mean, I really just, I feel like at this point in my life, I'm trying to reconcile all these different threads that have been so meaningful to me, from religion to psychedelic experience to community. And I'm really just motivated by trying to put that into words in a way that I can understand, but hopefully also helps other people on their journeys.
I love that, and I can attest that it does help people. Your writing has helped me. It's tremendous, really impactful, and of course, myself being kind of a psychedelic Jew as well, certainly relate to a lot of what you've written, and yeah, I mean, thank you for it. Excited to dig in and learn more. And something I ask everybody that comes on the show is, where did you grow up and what was it like? And you kind of referenced your book is kind of about that, so I'd love for you to go into that.
Yeah, so I grew up in LA, or I grew up in LA. My mom is from New York, so I had that as a huge influence. I would always go back and forth to New York when I was a kid, and I guess my whole life really has been a lot of back and forth. And my upbringing was pretty unique, you could say. My dad's a criminal defense lawyer who specializes in cannabis cases. He's also an old hippie, so he defended, for instance, Timothy Leary, who was a psychedelic evangelist in the 60s and ended up getting busted for weed. And my dad also is part of the community surrounding the guru named Curly Baba or Maharaji. And it's the same guru that Ram Dass had. They actually, my dad and Ram Dass met in India, and Ram Dass led him to meet the guru. Um, and so that was really the sort of religion and spirituality I grew up with, was very much based around the concepts of be here now and um, the philosophy of the guru. So it was a very Hindu, quote unquote, type.
Yeah, definitely sounds unique. I'm excited to read your book. I've read a lot of your articles and posts, um, and I, look forward to digging deeper into the specifics of your book. But, what would you say about your childhood sort of pushed you to want to give back in your career?
Yeah, I'm really influenced by my dad. I think that's pretty obvious to most people who know me or read my work. And, the philosophy is based on what Maharaji taught my father, which is that my dad in the 60s was a really successful criminal defense attorney. It was obviously a good time to get into drug law. And he had faced a lot of death and kind of just existential crisis, I guess you could say, at a very young age. His older brother died when my father was 14, and then my dad's own father died when my dad was 19. And so within like a 5, 6 year period, he'd seen just like the meaninglessness of life in a way, like where does it all go? And so he ended up in taking a sabbatical. He went to India, met Maharaji, and he was really ready to just like stay in India and be a hippie. And Maharaji said, no, you have to go back to America. You have a skill and you're helping people. And the best way to serve God is to serve other people. And, he did that to a few other people as well. For instance, Ram Dass went back, the kirtan artist Krishna Das, they all went back to America and kind of brought that philosophy and spirituality to the people they serve. And so my, what I learned was really just like be of service, and use the skills and talents that you have for something beyond yourself.
Yeah, I mean, that's a wonderful message to carry forward. And I think you've certainly been doing it justice. I also noticed when I was doing my research that you speak at least partially 5 languages, which is like kind of mind boggling to me. I'm curious, like, where did that interest come from? I have them as English, French, Hebrew, Russian, and some Yiddish.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can say I fluently speak any of them anymore, except when I was in middle school, I started studying French, and it came really easily to me. Some people are good at math, some people are good at whatever fill in the blank subject. I was really good at language. So I majored in linguistics in college, and studied uh, cognitive linguistics in particular, and looked into a theory called linguistic relativity, which is sort of how the language you speak and also the way that you speak it influences your perception of the world and kind of how you move through life and your culture and so forth. And I thought that was really interesting, especially coming from a family where my parents, use a little bit of Yiddish, and also during my time now, having spent a lot of time among Hasidim, I've been around a lot of Yiddish, and seeing how that really influences the whole culture. So yeah, again, I'm not fluent, but I did study all of those languages and am exposed to them on a regular basis.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that theory that you mentioned. The language that you speak and the way that you speak it affects sort of your perception of life. Um, Tell me more about that and what you learned. That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really good book called Born to Fetch, by Michael Wex, and it's sort of about the linguistic relativity as expressed through Yiddish. And I noticed, when I went to college, first of all, there's a lot of Yiddish terms that my parents use that I didn't even know were Yiddish. That's just part of the way we talk. And I grew up in a pretty Ashkenazi Jewish neighborhood, went to school with Ashkenazim. Like, I didn't notice that it was different. And I had a non-Jewish roommate my first semester at college, and I was using these words, like even basics like schlep or something, and she didn't know what I was talking about. And it really made me realize that I'm not like, and again, we don't have to get so political right now about questions of, are Jews white, or this and that, but it made me feel very ethnic in a way.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm really, especially as it relates to Hebrew and Yiddish, seeing how a lot of the words that we have and even our inflection and the way that we talk, their intonation, um, has a lot to do with like our cultural influence and a lot of even like the narrative of Judaism or the narrative of our people coming out in the tone of voice
Mm.
or in the fact that we're born to fetch, apparently.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, does that make sense at all? Or
I mean, to me, it certainly does. Being an Ashkenazi Jew, growing up with, grandparents that were Holocaust survivors, and my dad was born in Israel, so it does. I think I had a lot of those words in our household as well that you didn't really think twice about, but realized they're Yiddish later. Um, and yeah, there is sort of like when I think back to like my grandparents talking to each other, there is sort of like almost an anxiety to the tone.
yeah, there's a story that I tell in my book about my like thinking Yiddish or speaking Yiddishly or whatever. And it was I when I was in college, I had this boyfriend came from like a normal family, normal like, and he came over to the house, and my mom and I were having a discussion about like the curtains in my room, something really mundane. And when we left the house, he said to me, he said, "Did that argument really need to happen just now in front of me?" And I'm like, "What argument? Like, what are you talking?" Like with your mom, like the curtains, you guys were screaming at each other. And I'm like, no, we weren't. Like, we were just talking. And it was like, in that moment, I was like, okay, first of all, this relationship is not going to work. Like, second of all, like, it really woke me up to the fact that my mom and I talk in a very particular way. And it's like,
Yeah.
she's a New York Jew from Queens. And there's a certain uh, volume and shriekiness to the
Yeah.
conversation that is just so normal for us, and I think is so Jewish in a lot of ways, specifically New York. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. And, I'm just picturing certain individuals in my life that maybe we have those types of conversations. And, I appreciate you sharing that. And you ended up going to UC Berkeley. How did you end up there, and what was that experience like?
Yeah, I mean, I was really like drawn to the whole hippie thing, that I was raised in it, and part of me wanted to experience it on my own terms because it had sort of been, I didn't have a choice growing up, right? Like it was kind of shoved down my throat in a way. And but I kind of embraced it on my own terms as well. And so that's sort of why I was enthusiastic about Berkeley. I really wanted to go to New York and go to Columbia, and essentially I got into Berkeley, which is the top public school in California. And my dad's like, I'm not going to pay for you to go to school, like, and so I ended up there anyways for grad school at Columbia. But um, so yeah, Berkeley was great. I lived in a co-op. I was around really free-spirited, smart kids who I felt like I could relate to in a way that I didn't have that connection with anyone in high school. And I was also really involved with like Hillel, and they
Hmm.
paid me to do this. I had this internship where they would basically pay me to put on parties called Co-op Shabbat, and it was again getting all the hippie kids to come out and experience like this ecstatic Shabbos. So
Yeah.
so yeah. What was the question exactly about Berkeley, or it was just?
Just about your experience there. And it sounds like, you got a good experience. You got really engaged and involved, and built a community. I saw that additionally you were on the board of directors for California's SSDP, which I'm a huge fan of, Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And, I also saw that you founded Meal Points for the Homeless. I'd be curious to learn more about that.
Yeah, that was my first year, my freshman year. I just noticed that first of all, there's a lot of homeless people in Berkeley, and especially where the dorms are, or the dorm that I was living in particular, it was like right outside the dorm. There's just people on the street. It was also down the street from People's Park, which was kind of just like a homeless encampment off Telegraph Avenue. And I had all these extra meal points, and I noticed I just wasn't gonna use them up at the end of the year, and or this semester or whatever. And so I would just buy food and with the meal points and just like hand it out to homeless people and talk to them. And I've always had this thing for being either a magnet for or attracted to like very eccentric characters, and a lot of the unhoused people in Berkeley fall into that category. But yeah, we started an organization, Meal Points for the Homeless, and got other students as well to kind of contribute their extra meal points, and we just buy food and toiletries and stuff and hand them out.
Yeah, that's awesome. You found a good use for the excess that is often created in that atmosphere. And yeah, and I saw you're also involved with Berkeley Chabad, Sinai Scholars, Outreach Committee, and just overall, how do you think this college experience affected the rest of your path?
Yeah, I didn't know I was gonna get so like Jewishly involved. Like I wouldn't say that was my goal in Berkeley, but I ended up going to Shabbos dinner every week, like at Hillel, sometimes at Chabad. Um, there was this co-op called Lothlorien, which is known to be the naked hippie co-op, where every Friday night they'd have naked pizza Fridays, meaning that if you could cut to the front of the line. And they were vegetarian co-op, like the whole Berkeley stereotype, um, like militant hippie politics, stuff like that. Um, and right next door was another co-op called the Bite, which was a Jewish like kosher kitchen co-op. And um, sometimes I would crash there. Like I would study at a cafe nearby, and if I didn't feel like walking back to the one that I lived in, which was a little further away, I would just sleep on the couch at the Bite. And I Berkeley really, it was sort of the first iteration of me recognizing I had these two selves, which was that I was in the co-ops, which were all these psychedelic, free-spirited party kids, and then I was also going to Shabbos dinner every week. And I had these rabbis who were sort of watching over me and making sure that I didn't lose my mind, or that when I tried to dye my hair pink or something, like I wasn't going too far off the deep end. And it was, and it also really, again, like not to get overly political, but I came from a pretty Jewish neighborhood in Los Angeles, and I never kind of questioned. There was nothing to question. It was actually funny. Most of my high school was like at least 50% Persian, and I had this misconception that most Persians were Jewish, just because all the kids from my high school were Persian Jews. And so, Berkeley has like a very tense culture around Israel Palestine, and it wasn't something I understood, again, because I wasn't exposed to the issue growing up. For my parents, like New York was the homeland, like I'd never even been to Israel. And so that kind of primed me in an interesting way just to recognize that like this was a very sensitive thing. There was a lot of politics and protests and drama even in the time that I was there. And yeah, after Berkeley, I actually ended up living in Israel for a little while. So
How long were you in Israel for that stint?
that was like 6 months. I was doing a program where I was living in Tel Aviv and uh, interning at different refugee organizations, specifically catered toward Eritrean refugees. So I was like working with their kids and teaching English, and also then taking classes here and there, and just kind of living and experiencing life in between college and grad school.
Yeah, I think that's really important for I've got, nieces and nephews that are looking at colleges right now, and I'm just thinking back to it. I think it's important to have some time after college to continue exploring. I don't think that, if you're fortunate enough to have the opportunity, I don't know that the 4 years is enough. And obviously it takes some work to be able to do that. But, um, I think we were brought up, at least I was, in a culture that was like, you got to get moving, right after college. And um, I think it's great when people are able to take a little bit of time to get other experiences.
Yeah, I think, I was always on the law school path. Dad's a lawyer, my older sister's a lawyer. I thought I was going to be a lawyer. And so I took the LSAT a bunch of times, by which I mean I walked out of the LSAT a bunch of times and canceled my score and somehow could not get through, just couldn't get through that block. And so much so that I was like, okay, I'm going to have to take a gap year and like continue studying for the LSAT. And, in that time, I applied to journalism school on a whim and got into Columbia, and I was saying to myself, I love writing. I want to be in New York. Like, screw law school. I'm gonna be a journalist. So that's kind of how that happened. But I think it also required me to like get off the path, get off the train for a second and go to Israel and just experience myself and life and like what I actually care about in order to then redirect where I was going. Because so many people don't give themselves that opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost, you were taking a leap of faith, a faith in yourself in life. And it's, awesome that you're able to sort of follow that passion that you realize you have around writing. And certainly it's taken you a long way. How did that experience getting your master's at Columbia affect your ongoing path? I saw that you were in the Arab and Middle Eastern Journalists Association, the National Lesbian and Gay Journalists Association, the Society of Professional Journalists.
I've joined all those associations. where did you? I didn't even know I was part of these associations. That's
Oh,
fun.
it came up in my research. I don't know if it was like LinkedIn or a bio somewhere. So if
That's
they're
so.
wrong, let me know.
I don't know. I don't remember. Maybe okay, because I went to Columbia right after I was living in Israel, and so I probably joined the Arab and Middle East one because of uh, having just come out of Israel, and then the LGBTQ one. I was actually working for an organization called Oram, which helps LGBTQIA refugees from Africa seek asylum in places where they're not going to be persecuted based on account of their sexuality. So that was like that, plus the Eritrean refugees was sort of like what I was doing in Israel officially while I was applying to grad school. So it probably, I guess, what was the third organization that I was part of? There was.
Society of Professional Journalists.
Oh, okay. So whatever. I guess I was trying to network or something.
Yeah. My producer confirmed these came from LinkedIn.
LinkedIn, really? That's okay. Fascinating. I have been a while to even know what my LinkedIn says. Anyways, okay, so the whole path with journalism school was very much beshert in that first of all, I didn't even finish the application. Like I started this application for Columbia. I decided I was like, I'm not getting in. I have no professional experience in this. Like, scrap it, whatever. And um, I got a random call from the dean, like in December before, like 6 months before admissions, and they're like, "Why didn't you finish your application?" I said, "Because I'm not qualified." Like, whatever. And they're like, "No, finish it." And so then I finished it, and then I was in Israel, and then I got in, and I was like, "Okay, I'm going to go to New York." And then my first week in journalism school, every student was assigned an ethnic community to report on, and because I was one of two Jews in my reporting 101 class, I was given the Hasidim in Brooklyn, even though I really wanted the Russians in Brighton Beach to, practice my Russian. And yeah, that was just like kind of how everything started. I was having a lot of trouble breaking into Williamsburg, and it's just being Jewish doesn't cut it for breaking into the world's most insular
Yeah.
religious community. Um, and I ended up meeting this guy who was working at a kosher pizza shop, and he was on the spectrum of what you would call OTD, or off the derech, off the path, meaning that he was like negotiating his relationship to religion, one foot in, one foot out, and he would talk to me. And so he basically told me about all of these psytrance festivals he was going to upstate, and he and his friends like to trip. And I was like, wait, what? Like, the last thing I was expecting to hear from this kid who's 19-year-old, 20-year-old guy coming out of Williamsburg, Brooklyn, was that he was really into every psychedelic possible. And it just became this fascination, and I just like went for it and like dove right into that scene and met people who have become my best friends, and had relationships in that world, and sources and all sorts of it. Just really like became my life. So there was a total fate type of situation happening.
And when you say you jumped into that scene, is that like the Jewish psychedelic scene or?
Yeah, that was the beginning of it. In the Jewish psychedelic scene, at least as I experienced it in, my early days of, being aware of this, was, had different branches, right? Like you could say that the Ramdas scene is Jewish psychedelic, right? A bunch of post-Holocaust Jews getting into psychedelics, then integrating it through Hindu philosophy. But so when I was in journalism school and I was hanging out with these Hasidim from Williamsburg, and they were telling me about their psytrance festivals and doing ketamine and Molly and acid and whatever. That was one branch of it. And then I got connected to a few other people who were doing ayahuasca circles and Brooklyn basement salons and stuff like that, and using nigunam and prayer as part of the medicine and medicine music. And, on Shabbos or in relationship to like a particular holiday or something like that. And it just totally transformed my relationship to Judaism and
Hmm.
myself and to psychedelics
Yeah.
community.
Yeah, I can certainly relate to that as well. Having grown up a certain way, going to conservative shul and, being pushed to do all of the things and just, wanting to take a break from that when I was in charge of my life. And then, psychedelics were part of, I think, what reconnected me to my Judaism. And it's fascinating how it connects and sort of how certain psychedelics can kind of connect you with your ancestors. And it's really powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I didn't expect to feel so connected, especially to like certain Nigunim that I didn't know, but I knew, if that makes sense, right? Like on a soulful level, everything, it was all feeling very familiar, even though I didn't necessarily grow up with the music. I feel like it was still mine.
Yeah, 100%. That makes sense. And so, you mentioned sort of diving into that scene, but meanwhile, you were also an editorial fellow for The Forward and The Village Voice. You served on the rapid response team at the Christian Science Monitor. Can you tell me how those positions affected your path?
Yeah, so like I said, I didn't have official journalism media experience before going to grad school. And my lovely career counselor told me that on account of not having experience, I'd be one of the, you know, 10% of the class who doesn't get a job in journalism after this $60,000 program. And I was like, fuck you. That was real. I was just like really, really not happy to hear that. Really, really discouraging. And my response was that I worked my ass off. I really, really, really worked hard. I ended up getting, so I got a fellowship at the Forward right after I graduated. And first, I actually got an internship at Paper Magazine, and then the Forward offered me a paid fellowship, so I quit Paper Magazine and went to the Forward. And at the same time, I had written a story um, in my magazine writing class about New York's medical marijuana program. And an editor at the Village Voice, who I met at a career fair, was really interested in the story and bought the story and then gave me a job reporting on cannabis for the Village Voice. So again, I've always had these two threads of Jews and drugs,
Yeah.
from college and then journalism, and I guess my life in general has always had that as in different iterations. So after the Forward Fellowship ended, I went to work at the Village Voice, and then when I was there, their leadership changed. The paper got sold. They had a new editor in chief, and the editor told me, "Oh, it's too cliche for the Voice to cover drugs. Like this, you're out. Like I'm not publishing your psychedelic cover story." Even though Michael Pollan just published his trip treatment story in the New Yorker, like in that same time period. So I was like, I think, this drug, cannabis, and psychedelic journalism is going somewhere, but okay. So that was really heartbreaking. And, the Christian Science Monitor and Vice and Rolling Stone, I basically just started freelancing a lot. Like I didn't have a full-time job, so I was really filling everything out with freelance stuff, and I had to pay back my student loans from journalism school.
So was that freelance process like you would write stuff and then pitch it, or was it more you talk to contacts, what are you looking for? I'll write it.
It was both. Christian Science Monitor and Vice, and a few other publications like Mary Jane, for instance, which is a cannabis outlet. I had working permalance relationships with, so I'd owe them like 3 stories a week or something like that. And it wasn't like a full time job with benefits, but it was like a regularly paying thing where the editor would say, "Hey, we need this. Can you jump on it?" Or what do you have this week?" And then other stuff I would do to fill out my portfolio. So I would really try to, write for Rolling Stone as often as I could, or Playboy, or bigger name magazines, and I'd pitch them with my ideas.
Yeah, I mean, that's incredible experience just to be able to contribute for those outlets. And I imagine your writing spoke for yourself and itself in terms of getting you into these roles. And you mentioned some of these really interesting publications that you've written for. I saw you were also a columnist for LA Weekly, and then also an associate editor and features editor for Civilized Magazine.
Hmm. Yeah, I forgot about all these things. It's so funny. I was writing for LA Weekly really regularly. I ended up burning out on freelancing. I applied to this job at Civilized, which is a cannabis magazine, and they gave me a full-time job as an editor, and it was, cool to have a job with a capital J and a 401k and health insurance and all this stuff. And I I I but when I was there, I like really missed. I don't know, it was sort of not it wasn't as fun and creative as when I was just really just like following my intuition and, pitching stories that I cared about. So I always on the side, I was still doing Jewish journalism. For instance, like I really wanted to go to the Rainbow Gathering, so I pitched a story on it to Tablet so I could pay for my flight to go to Wisconsin and buy a bunch of camping materials and go to Rainbow and write a Jewish angle story on it. And then when I was at Civilized, I ended up co-founding Double Blind on the side, and so I was kind of working these two jobs. And when Civilized kind of ran out of money and shut down, I went straight into working full time at Double Blind.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I can imagine how freelance can be joining, like sort of that, or draining, excuse me, sort of paycheck to paycheck, getting that opportunity to see, at least feel what it was like to have that job with a capital J, as you described it. Um, and then Double Blind, tell me about that, how it started, what it is.
It started out as an idea that came to my co-founder when she was meditating. I knew her from Colombia, and she called me right after finishing her meditation session and just said, "Do you want to start a psychedelic magazine?" I said, "Sure," even though I had just started this job with Civilized. And we started it as a print publication, and ended up getting PR help from Zoe Wilder, who's just an amazing publicity whiz, and Mike Schur, partner, and we got social media help from Sarah Schnur, and it really just snowballed and got bigger than we had ever imagined. And we put everything online as well as printing the magazine, and it was a really cool platform for just kind of using psychedelics as a jumping off point to talk about spirituality and mental health and environmentalism and all sorts of other things that touch the psychedelic beat, so to speak.
And what's the current status of Double Blind?
Yeah, Double Blind is still going. I'm not working there full time anymore, but I am working on a third party book for with Double Blind called The Double Blind Guide to Psychedelics, which is kind of like a tripping 101 type of thing. And yeah, thank God they're still publishing.
I'm glad to hear that you're putting that book together. I mean, the thing about drugs and drug policy is there's just been so much knowledge hidden over the years, research that hasn't been done or it's been done underground. And so people that are first coming into, drugs in general don't necessarily have any trusted sources. I mean, yeah, there's some books out there, but and you can Google around and you're going to get 10 different answers to one question, but I think it's really good to hear that that book is coming, and I think it can be daunting to like maybe connect with this community and decide you want to dig into learning more about yourself and digging deeper with these medicines and not knowing anything. I got involved in the cannabis industry 8 years ago, and that slowly got me integrated in sort of a psychedelic community as well, and it's certainly coming in with no knowledge of any of it was daunting, and so having a book like that I can imagine being very helpful.
Yeah, it's really like, hopefully going to be a sort of beautiful product, both visually appetizing and also has straight up information. Another resource that I'll just point to is something I worked on recently called Psychedelic U, which is a platform on Lucid News, and it's again, it's like really straightforward, goes by each substance or each condition or the science, and it just puts it all in one place. It's kind of like an updated Arrowwood. If for those who know what Arrowwood is, it's like the drug nerd website of the 90s. So yeah, I really recommend that. It's still in its beta, but I refer to it a lot just because it's everything consolidated in one place.
Yeah. And what is your perspective on just like the current state of the psychedelic movement, whether that's in policy or in pop culture or just in your world?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a lot of excitement about it, the same way we saw a lot of excitement with cannabis, and I do think that's I don't want to say it's waning, but I do think that it's kind of a more sobering reality than what people think. Psychedelics are not going to be federally legal for a while, and even then, even like MDMA and psilocybin are both fast tracked by the FDA to become approved medications and assisted psychotherapy. But the accessibility is a question, and there's all sorts of considerations about bringing these to market in a fair and equitable, accessible way. So that's one thing. Another thing that I really want to say about the psychedelic movement and where it's going is it's just like culturally, I really hope that people make this not really about psychedelics, meaning to say that they talk about like mainstreaming psychedelics, which is great, except for that, like, why should this? I think the mainstream should become more psychedelic rather than the opposite. Like, we don't need to sort of squeeze psychedelics into these like you know, systems that haven't been working and are the reasons why people are seeking out alternative therapies. And I think to try to make psychedelics accommodate these broken systems is just so not the point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a tremendous point. And, myself having done a lot of work in drug policy, it's something that we struggle with in terms of, we need to get this out there. We have to kind of work in the system that exists, but it is not ideal. And so we have to find ways while making it exist in this system to break through. And I feel like, Rick Doblin is the ultimate example of that, just sort of playing in the system because that's the only way to move things forward. And so I think that, it's unfortunate, but hopefully it opens doors to creating new pathways. And I think that, in terms of like the interest sort of dying down, sort of the sexiness, if you will, of like cannabis and psychedelics, a plus side is like they are becoming more normalized. Hopefully we'll continue to lessen the number of people getting put in prison over these substances. But like you said, I really liked the way that you put it about the mainstream becoming more psychedelic and not vice versa. Because I often think like, man, if we could get a big chunk of the angry world to have some psychedelic experiences, what a better place it could be. And I think you put that very well. So how do we, as psychedelic and drug policy advocates, how do we kind of help that happen, help the mainstream become more psychedelic?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with identifying the psychedelic ethos and the psychedelic consciousness, because the reality is that not everyone is going to have access to psychedelics. Not everyone's going to want to take psychedelics. Psychedelics are really not about the substances, but about the consciousness that they open us up to. So, how can we spread that consciousness rather than just spreading the medicines themselves? And it's also because, like, and just speaking of like psychedelic Judaism or whatever, I wrote in my book, or I quoted Rabbi Nachman as talking about if you rely on a medicine to sort of like do the same thing every time, it kind of borders on sort of like idolatry, meaning to say that like it's not always the same. Mushrooms are not going to act the same every time you do them, and if you expect that, it's like putting too much emphasis on the mushrooms rather than on this feeling of consciousness and spiritual connection that you're actually seeking out, which you could get through all different types of means. So number one, I would say identifying the ethos of psychedelics. Now, how can you identify that ethos? At least I personally look at the mystical experience questionnaire, which is used in psychedelic science to identify the qualities of mysticism as induced by psilocybin. And that has different criteria. One of them is a sense of oneness. And what is oneness but like empathy or connection to others, connection to God, connection to environment, connection to nature, etc. And so, how can we implement that as a value, this oneness, connection, whatever, in the systems that we have at play? So how are systems kind of integrating psychedelic consciousness and um, providing opportunities and containers to hold and harness that sense of consciousness after the acute effects of the medicine wear off? So it's really about finding it's really about integration. That's definitely more the medicine than the actual substances. And um, like I said, then putting that into practice and application for whatever it is that, whatever sector of society you work in, whether it's politics or environmentalism or healthcare or whatever. And I think, by enabling us to think out of the box and really go past binary thinking and fixed ways of consciousness, that's what's going to really open us up into psychedelic thinking, and or psychedelicize the mainstream.
Yeah, no, I think that is a really interesting perspective and such important points. I mean, it's really about the essence of the feelings that are created and the consciousness, as you mentioned, and the oneness that you mentioned that just really resonates with me. And that's when I say that I want more people to have these experiences. That I want more people to feel that. I want all of the hate in the world, just for those people to feel that we are all one. We are all part of this universe together and just trying to make it through whatever this life is together. And what a better place it could be. And yeah, I've been trying to figure out the best ways to sort of spread that kind of message.
Yeah, I mean, I think that message is also all over the religions of the world. And I always say that, for instance, like, you don't have to take psychedelics to have a psychedelic experience. And so there are other things that you can do to both, like, become more in touch with your soul and more in touch with your kind of embodiment, your soul in a body. And I think and in nature. So whether it's breath work or yoga or chanting or dancing or meditation or prayer, there's all different embodied techniques and modalities that can conjure a psychedelic experience and put people in that state of mind as they kind of then move through the world.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And, thank you for that. And, I'm curious about you. You have a podcast as well, I believe, Set and Setting,
Yeah.
on the Be Here Now network. What is the focus of that, and where can people check it out?
Yeah. You can check it out on Spotify or I guess wherever podcasts are platformed. And yeah, Be Here Now Network has a lot of different podcasts. And mine, Set and Setting, is, first of all, the term set and set. It's a nod to the term set and setting, which looks at the internal state that one brings to a psychedelic experience. There's psycho emotional, spiritual, uh, mental state, and then also the surroundings that could influence the experience. So, what time of day is it? Who are you with? Is it a party? Is it a therapy session? Whatever. And I think set and setting applies not just to a psychedelic experience, but to life in general. You can always evaluate your set and setting. And I interview people about their spiritual practices and psychedelic experiences and how those experiences have helped them become more of who they are and inspired them to do whatever work they're doing in the world.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, similarly on this show, I'm trying to figure out how people became who they are, became someone that gives back. And it sounds like you're doing that, specifically from kind of a spiritual perspective. And I think that sounds fascinating. I look forward to listening. If you're enjoying this episode, I would greatly appreciate if you could review, like, comment, or subscribe on your favorite platforms. Your engaged support goes a long way in helping the show grow and getting our impactful guests heard. Now back to the show. I want to talk about your book that's coming out, Exile and Ecstasy, Growing Up with Ram Dass and Coming of Age in the Jewish Psychedelic Underground. I have it on pre-order, so I haven't read it yet, but very much looking forward to it. So we went into it briefly in the intro in terms of what the book is, but let's dig in. Tell me more about it.
Yeah, so I kind of describe it as a gonzo journalistic memoir. And so it talks about growing up in the communities surrounding Ram Dass, among the Hindus, and then finding my way in the psychedelic Jewish underground in New York and also in Israel, and kind of reconciling all of these threads. And, I grew up seeing my parents and all their friends chanting in Sanskrit, like at kirtan, which are Hindu chanting events. And I'd say, like, here's a bunch of Jews who claim they could not connect they couldn't connect to Hebrew, and they checked out of, traditional Judaism, but meanwhile they're chanting in another language that they don't understand, and, like, why are they feeling more connected here? And I think a lot of it has to do with post-Holocaust, internalized anti-Semitism and, like, this fear of really associating with your Jewishness. Ram Dass has actually just been quoted on that. Like, the pain of the Jewish experience was too much for him to handle. And my book gets into sort of the Jewish history and Jewish legacy of Ram Dass in particular, as kind of this archetype for that movement. Um, and so, yeah, and then it also looks, I kind of use myself as a character to say, do these spiritual um, technologies and psychedelic consciousness modalities even work? Like, what's the point of them? And it's a very vulnerable book. I talk about, for instance, in high school, I had an eating disorder and, really feeling dissociated from my body, and so much of the rebellion that I could kind of, my active rebellion in a household where Be Here Now was, like the ethos was to dissociate, and how it's taken me, almost a decade or more at least, to reassociate with my body and to actually really inhabit, be a soul who is inhabiting this container here on earth, and what am I doing with it? And so it's really not just about, like I said, it's not about psychedelics, but it's about where do psychedelics take you and how do you practice it. And I think I've seen that most in both the Rainbow gatherings and in Tzfat, where I kind of live part-time and where I wrote the book. Because Rainbow, for instance, uses kind of psychedelic ethos of oneness and connection to nature and puts it into practice in this like utopic village in the woods. And Spot, on the other hand, is like just being there is feels like a trip, and it's in the air, literally, spiritually, energetically, whatever. And so the book kind of ends on those notes, taking you through this whole story of, also my psychedelic trip tales and going to India and Israel and, times in New York. So yeah.
I don't want my knowledge base to sort of cloud what the listeners are getting understanding of. So maybe if you could just explain to the listeners that don't know who Ram Dass is.
Yeah. So Ram Dass was born Richard Alpert. He was a psychedelic researcher at Harvard, doing psychological studies and so forth, using LSD and psilocybin, psilocybin being the active compound in magic mushrooms. And he was working alongside Timothy Leary, and it turns out, essentially their research went too far. I think they were tripping alongside their study subjects and dosed an undergrad or something, and they got fired from Harvard. And Richard Alpert, as he was known, um, went into some sort of existential spiritual crisis of what do I do now? And he ends up in India, um, kind of becoming a student or disciple of the guru named Curly Baba, and distilled his teachings into a book called Be Here Now, and several other books later on. And Be Here Now is, his most famous, and was really, what colored so much of my childhood, at least, was that as a guiding philosophy. Yeah.
And I know I read one of your articles about it, but talk about your personal relationship with Ram Dass.
Yeah, I mean, he was just like my dad's friend. He'd be like, he'd come when he was in town, he would come through. He would, I think, he'd come for dinner. He also performed the marriage ceremony of my dad and stepmom. And, at the time, I was a kind of an angry tween, and my parents had gotten divorced, and I really hated him for it, for getting involved in our family drama. Um, I do have a funny story with Ram Dass where when I was 16, my mom took me and my brother to visit him, and we were in Hawaii. And as all, like I said, my mom and I are always fighting or talking slash yelling, and um, I I was angsty, and so I would do this thing. I thought I was so clever. I would give her the middle finger by scratching my face like this with my middle finger, and so she told on me to Ram Dass. Like, granted, he's a therapist, so he can handle it. And and then when we left the house, he waved goodbye to me, and he scratched his cheek with his middle finger, and it was just like making fun of me, but in this really gentle way, and it just made the whole thing just like okay, And I think that's right. That's what Ram Dass really is like, on some level. I feel like a little bit like he can be a troll, or at least in my life, I feel like I tried to push him away, but then I kept coming back to it. And he also, yeah, like his teachings are so relatable, and I think if you listen to him and the way he talks and his use of Yiddishisms, he's really speaking to himself and the audience who can relate to his journey and his background.
Yeah, I mean, what an incredible figure, and to have gotten that direct time with him is, I imagine, a blessing, and really appreciate you sharing that. And also, if you could, you mentioned that you spend a lot of time in Tzfat. Maybe tell people a little bit more about Tzfat.
Yeah, Tzfat is known as the birthplace of Kabbalah or Jewish mysticism. It's a mountainous little city in northern Israel, across the valley from the gravesite of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was the, you know, author of the Zohar, apparently, as they say. And yeah, I mean, I just am in love with it. It's you can visit Spot for a day and it's gorgeous, but it's really more, you have to be there for at least 3 days. It's this whole experience of time and space that just is in its own rhythm, and it's the kind of place that feels like it's always Shabbat there. And there's so many tripped out, mystical, interesting people coming through, and the musical scene is amazing. And when I'm there, I just feel really healthy. Like it's also a place of healing. A lot of healer type people go there, and it's said you're healing through like the orifices of your face, that like the openings that kind of receive the air. And each of the four holy cities in Israel, like Jerusalem is fire, and Tiberia is water, and Sfat is air. So I relate to it that way. And then the last fun fact about Sfat is it's also a refuge city. So originally it was the kind of place, it was the place where you'd go to where if you accidentally killed someone, you could go to seek refuge in Sfat. And so it has that energy of, just like people who are, like in their own, on their own trip, like a little bit different, a little bit wacky, but not bad people. Again, it was like people who accidentally killed someone. So that was I don't know how long ago, but it's like original intention. But yeah, and it has grave sites, which and cool caves to go into, and mountains and valleys.
Yeah, and I thank you for that description of it. I've been a couple times on visits to Israel, but hearing you talk about it makes me want to spend some extended time there.
Yeah, I'll tour you around. Yeah,
Yeah,
also good cheese and really good art
yeah, and I recall some wine as well.
and good wine. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, it's very simple but very rich at the same time.
yeah, awesome. Well, I look forward to the next visit there, and um, I recall that I meant to ask about Ayin Press, where you're a contributing editor. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, Ayin is, I think, my favorite place that I've ever written for before. And it's because they're just so smart and so open and so sophisticated, and really taking Jewish literature, not just Jewish, like emanating outward from Jewish thought, you could say, um, and being innovative about it. And so they've really given me a platform to explore a lot of psychedelic stories. I wrote a story about doing 5-MeO DMT and dealing with my own Jewish trauma. I wrote a story on the Jewish legacy of Ram Dass. I also have a column with Ayin called Speaking from Experience, where I interview people about kind of paradigm shifting encounters. I spoke with Rick Strassman, who is an FDA approved DMT researcher. I spoke with Krishna Das, who's a Grammy nominated kirtan artist from the Hindu Ram Dass scene. I spoke with who else? Hadar Cohen, who's a mystic and educator, Natalie Ginsburg from MAPS. Um, and yeah, I also did a couple of things with Ayin that were less journalistic and more like Jewishly innovative. We made these psychedelic companion guides for the holidays of Passover and Sukkot. So if you're combining psychedelics with your Jewish practice, or if you're looking to feel into the altered nature of Jewish experience through ritual, these are sort of little zines that help you recognize that and practice it. So a lot of really good work coming out with Ayin. I'm also looking into a story right now about Israelis and Palestinians doing ayahuasca together, and the promise of, again, I won't say psychedelics, but psychedelic consciousness into the conflict.
Yeah, and speaking of the conflict, we've sort of been waiting to talk about it. October 7th, there was obviously the major brutal terrorist attack by Hamas, and especially for people in Israel and for Jews and for Gazans, life has been very different since October 7th, and I imagine you have a pretty unique perspective on it. I believe you were in Israel at the time. And so, yeah, I just would love for you to kind of share your perspective on the situation.
Yeah, I was in Israel. It was funny because I was in Tzfat, and like everyone there keeps Shabbos pretty much. So even Saturday morning, Simchas Torah, Shabbos morning, people were talking about there was an attack, um, and I guess I think a whole yeshiva was taken out into the reserves that day. Um, and so by the end of Shabbos, everyone's just on their phones. And at first it was, I mean, it's still really scary, but no one knew what was going on except that there were a lot of Hamas terrorists on the ground infiltrating Israel. Not just, that they were, in the south and had done these massacres and kidnapping. Like, it was just no one could fathom. Like, it wasn't just like, I got a text from my mom, like, hey, there was a terror attack in Tel Aviv, which, not that that's any less, like, that's par for the course, but like this was clearly on a magnitude that is much more than an isolated attack. And yeah, it was, it was, in Tzfat, thank God it was like in the north, even though there was, I didn't really want to like be alone at night or lock my doors. Again, it wasn't like missiles coming in. Also, it was that too, but like it was, God forbid, like people on the ground. Um, and then obviously, then, what's going on in Gaza is, yeah, again, I'm not here to like, I don't want to say one thing or the other. I'm very careful not to say too much because I'm not officially Israeli and I didn't grow up there, and I feel like I'm not licensed to have an opinion the same way people who live this conflict day in and day out do. Even though I am kind of partial resident and have a pending Aliyah application, um, it's like I see everyone mouthing off on the internet who have no connection to Israel or Palestine or Judaism or anything, any identity that is related to this conflict or has a stake in it. And I think that's just like so. Again, I experienced that at UC Berkeley and 10 years ago. But what I was saying about Gaza is that, you know, trauma just begets more trauma. And so even if Hamas were theoretically wiped out, I'm afraid that the people who are being displaced and being traumatized and losing their families and being injured and everything that's happening is only going to create, unless there's like some sort of radical initiative, therapy initiative or whatever, which it's going to take generations to heal from this. And a lot of people who do, I interviewed somebody who I was in Ramallah a couple of days before the attacks, doing an interview with someone with Suli Khatib, and when he was a teenager, he had done attacks on Jews, like part of the freedom fighting, whatever, and he was in prison for a long time and ended up starting an organization, Combatants for Peace, like a nonviolence activist organization around the conflict. But I guess what I'm saying is like people who are enacting terror are also coming from traumatized situations and, have been victims of terror too. So I don't know what's going to be. And the other thing I'll say is that there's so many ways to look at this. And if you go to a place like Tzfat, word on the street is like Mashiach is right around the corner, like for real this time. And
Yeah,
it's not,
Messiah, yeah.
it's not funny. I'm like laughing at it, but I'm not
Yeah.
laughing. Like, I don't even know what to believe it anymore. I'm like, maybe we really are like, maybe we're really approaching the end of the world. Like, I don't know.
It's a strange time, and these things, are very emotional. And, you mentioned that you don't feel like you necessarily, should be the one speaking on, or that you deserve an opinion. But, you do spend a lot of time in Israel. Like you said, you're applying for Aliyah to live there. And, but, I think it's important for society to know how much this affects all Jews. Myself, having grown up, like I mentioned, with parents or grandparents that were Holocaust survivors, it was bred into me to be concerned that this could happen again, and to be aware of this, and to keep an eye out for hatred towards Jews. And, my parents getting bullied as kids for being Jews with immigrant parents and things like that. And so, and my wife and I both have friends and family in Israel. So it's really hit home for us, even beyond the fact that it's going on over there. Obviously there's been a tremendous rise in anti-Semitism here in the US. And, I have a kid going to a Jewish daycare, and it's just like, there's just so many scary aspects of it. There've been local threats and things like that. So, talking to friends over there that are there, it sounds like living kind of in a nightmare in some respects. And over here, it's tense still.
It's really tense. I honestly, like, I left Israel because I had to go to a work event. Like, I had a flight already. If I hadn't had a flight, I don't think I would have left even with the war. I mean, maybe at this point, I don't know, but like, I, again, and what I'm saying is it feels worse here. And there's a thing that I experienced. I do think the war, unfortunately, is like a psychedelic experience. And what I mean by that is there was a moment where I was, right before I was leaving Tzfat, the sirens started going off, and I didn't even know if I'd be able to like drive the 2 hours to the airport, because like I didn't know if there was people coming in, like there was missiles coming in from Hezbollah and people flying in on like suicide bombers were flying in. Again, I don't know. It all turned out to be a false alarm, which was also very weird. But like at that point, it's like in a minute, it was like it reminded me of the time I did 5-MeO DMT, and like the realizations that came to me very instantly. And when you're in that kind of situation, you just realize what's important so quickly, and who's important, and like what's real and what's just like sheker, what's not, and so it's like here I am, like supposed to be promoting a book and doing podcasts and all this stuff, and I feel like anything like I feel really messed up posting on anything that's not related to the conflict. And at the same time, like I said, I'm like I feel very like I'm just so heartbroken about it that like I haven't even been able to articulate what I'm feeling or what to say if I were to post about it. Um and yeah, and I, like I said, I was only there for like a little bit of the war, um and I'm worried again. I worry about my parents like walking to shul and Pico Robertson. Like I think about having book events, and God forbid they could be targeted because I'm Jewish and they're a Jewish event. And the type of anti-Semitism, I don't know a single Jewish person right now who at least identifies Jewishly who is okay.
Yeah, I agree with you as well. And, I certainly, it resonates with me what you said about like it feels wrong to do anything else. And I've had that experience as well. Just like hard to focus on anything else, hard to dedicate myself to things that, quote, need to get done in, whether it's my business or philanthropic world, um, because of what's going on there being so all consuming. Yet we have to continue to live life. And we have to continue to, what's the point if we don't? And, so you going out and promoting your book, I think, is important. And, I mentioned to you before our call, this is the first time I've recorded an episode besides the one specifically on Israel, since the time. And it hasn't felt right to do other stuff. And it still doesn't in many ways, but, I feel like we need to do it.
It does sort of push everything into a more tachlis perspective. For I guess for those in the audience who don't know what tachlis means, it's like straightforward to the point, and it really has me asking myself like, what is the point of psychedelics or cannabis or journalism or anything if like here we are facing a life and death situation for so many people on the ground in Israel, Palestine, Gaza, like, and how, and like I said, it forces everything into a level of reality that just like, it's like cut the bullshit, what actually matters, and how can we apply our work and the ethos of what we're doing toward something that again is like gets so straight to the point of like what's in our hearts and souls and like the collective, I do think there's a collective soul of the Jewish people. I think that's why we're all so affected by it, but also like how can we relate and empathize with our neighbors, with Palestinians who are also living in the land, and people, kind of getting past the binary of politics into a trauma informed perspective that acknowledges everyone's humanity and also holds space for there being multiple truths. And I think that's what psychedelic thinking is like, what is expanded consciousness if not being able to say, oh, I'm right and you're right and they're right, and like we don't, like, it doesn't have to be a right or wrong or he or she or right or left or religious or secular, Israeli, Palestinian, but like holding that all as one, that is the most psychedelic thing possible, and is what inspires me to continue working in this field at this point.
Yeah, it's important work that you're doing. I certainly appreciate it. I think that all of your type of work, people that are doing similar work, moving us in the right direction of consciousness, and certainly thank you for it. And um, we could obviously talk about the situation in Israel all day, but I'm not going to let us. We're going to move on to some kind of zoomed out questions that I have on your overall experience. And I'm curious, through all of your work and through helping people over these many years, do you have any stories of when you really saw like that your work was directly affecting change?
Yes, I'd say oftentimes people do message me on social media or whatever and will say like, I read something that you wrote and it's really inspired me to get back into my Judaism, or to, explore psychedelics or whatever. And I wouldn't say like I ever set out to be the shliach for the Jewish religion or psychedelics or anything, but it so happens that I guess what I'm saying or putting out there on the internet is inspiring people in certain directions. And if something I write or say inspires someone to nourish their souls, and to get into their bodies in a way that they haven't before and become healthier people, God willing, then that's huge for me. That's really like redeems all of the stress that goes into this job.
Yeah,
Um, so that's just one thing. I feel like there's other stuff that I'm not thinking of, but like just looking at like the sway of public opinion and public consciousness around psychedelics and the role of media in shifting public opinion, and then seeing how that plays out in policy changes and continued scientific research and progress. I think it's all part of an ecosystem, so I just feel like I have a role there, but I
yeah,
don't take full responsibility for changing the system at large.
understood. Well, we certainly appreciate your role in that. And you've mentioned the influence of your father, the influence of Ram Dass. Anyone in particular that you want to highlight as a specifically impactful mentor?
I don't know if Rabbi Nachman counts as a mentor because he's not in his body, but if you read my book, you see that he's really like my biggest teacher. Him and Ram Dass, and just so much like on a daily basis, so much of Rabbi Nachman's philosophy, Chassidus, like inspires me and like really gives me the koach, like gives me the energy to continue with what I'm doing.
And could you tell us a little bit more about Rabbi Nachman?
Yeah, so he is a Hasidic rabbi, who was born in Ukraine, and some 200 plus years ago, and he's buried in Uman. And so every year, his followers go to his gravesite on Rosh Hashanah, um, and so it's known as like the Hasidic Burning Man is Uman Rosh Hashanah. I still am trying to get myself to Uman. I've tried and failed multiple years in a row. Um, but his whole philosophy was that on the most basic level, and there's a lot more trippy, complex Torahs that he puts out there. But he's coming from a place of like, it's very, the biggest mitzvah, the biggest thing you can do is to be happy. Okay, that sounds so simple, but it's coming from a place of facing darkness and embracing it, and embracing like the lowest lows in life, and being able to transform it and transform yourself and your perspective. And it's like, from the furthest places, the lowest places, do we have the greatest opportunity to connect with God and connect with ourselves. And so, I think of it like pulling an arrow back all the way so it has the most momentum to like shoot forward. So that's one thing. Another thing, he talks a lot about fear, and like, kind of, this is just like Rabbi Nachman 101, like one of his famous quotes is like, life is a narrow bridge. The best thing, the most important thing is to not be afraid. It's like, how are you supposed to not be afraid when you have inherited trauma and when your body is programmed to be afraid? And how can you really like build up a confidence in yourself and a certain faith in God, or in just a certain faith that things are okay? Like, what is it to reprogram your nervous system to believe that things are okay and that you're safe, especially in times like these? So again, it's like a simple Torah, but is so relevant, especially now. And then he has a lot of interesting philosophy around dance and around breath, and around a practice called hisbodedus, which is basically talking to God as if he's your best friend and just taking time alone with him. And I think that's just been a huge thing for me in my own kind of spiritual relationships. So, yeah.
Wow, it sounds like he was tremendously impactful. It's really cool to hear how his impact continues to sustain through you and other followers. I certainly will dig deeper on his work. And if you'd like, this is the point in the podcast where you can ask me a question.
Yeah. I guess like, you talked about, you're talking to me about psychedelics. I met you through, I think, the Jewish Psychedelic Summit. You have a background in cannabis. Like, what's inspired you to get into this field?
Yeah. Growing up in the South, drugs were demonized. I grew up in South Carolina, and so I just it was just taught to me that they're wrong. So I didn't really think much about them. I had friends in high school that consumed cannabis and stuff like that. But, went to college, and then, was a little more exposed, but didn't try it. And then in my early 20s, finally tried cannabis, and was just like confused as to why I'd been taught what I'd been taught. Like, I really enjoyed it, and started digging deeply into the research, and then eventually got involved in the cannabis business as an entrepreneur. And as I did that, I was quickly sort of, my eyes were open to the atrocities of the war on drugs, that I had been privileged to not really know a lot about. And, I was really disgusted. And I think, Ethan Nadelman and I talked a little bit about this on our podcast, and we'll talk more when we do one about drug policy. But I think part of like my disgust with our criminal justice system is my Jewish upbringing, and having the Holocaust in my DNA. I was just sickened to know that for this plant that we were creating a business around, that is a helpful herbal medicine, that there were people rotting in jail for it and not getting to live life, which is just such a horrible, horrible thing. So I just really dug deep on drug policy reform, joined the Board of Marijuana Policy Project, and, started working with organizations like SSDP and MAPS, and DPA. And so that was really like, now my business partner runs most of the day-to-day on our cannabis operations. My involvement in drugs is mostly on the policy and advocacy side these days. And it's really just the human nature of this, and just like the fact that, especially the whole disproportionate enforcement by race, like I just felt very connected to it, even though I am so far from it in many ways. And so that really pushed me to dig in. And as I, did dig into drug policy, I started to, meet people, like I mentioned, MAPS. I met a lot of people through MAPS and other organizations that introduced me to the healing potential of psychedelic experiences. And so, I started to have some of those myself, both in like professional treatment settings as well as outside of those settings. And really just opened my eyes to a lot of things, and changed the way that I think. As you've mentioned, they can do for people. And so, yeah, I mean, I am passionate about it, and passionate about bringing, I like the way that you put it. I normally would say like bringing these medicines to the world, but really just bringing the consciousness and awareness to the world. So try to do whatever I can to push the cause forward.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for all your work in it. And it reminds me of something I interviewed. I think it was either Rick Doblin. Interviewed both Rick Doblin and Ethan Nadelman for Story once, and one of them said, or maybe they echoed each other, but like, why are there so many Jews in drug policy? And it's that drugs have always been scapegoated for the ills of society, and as Jews, we're familiar with what it's like to be a scapegoat. So you said, so you talked about like a familiarity, but I think it maybe it has to do with that.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true. And yeah, I'm going to continue to do everything I can to help end the war on drugs. And I appreciate your work as well. And I got a couple more for you we're going to squeeze in. I know we're on a bit of a time crunch. Aside from family, if everything were to end tomorrow, whatever that means to you, what are you most grateful for or most proud of?
Yeah, aside from family, you said?
Yeah, I mean, if you can always throw in a family line, but people like that. People always mention family, which is important, but you know.
Yeah, I think I'm most grateful for the time that I've spent in Tzfat. It really is just like the closest to Geula I think I've ever experienced. Also with the rainbow gatherings, and they have a little bit of the similar energy where it's like the world outside Rainbow and the world outside Tzfat is like, in Rainbow they call it Babylon, right? It's like imperialist, like industry, like all that crap that's actually not the real reality of life and soul. And what am I most proud of? A good question. I mean, I guess I can say my book, but it's like it's more that I've lived this life, I think, and like my book just like is encapsulates the life I've lived so far, and that I don't know, that I like do yoga regularly and have maintained my health. I mean, I think that's huge that that I have a relationship with God. I think that's it.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And the last big question I ask everyone: if you could snap your fingers and fix one thing in the world, what would it be, and how do you think that change would reverberate?
My God. I should ask for peace. I think. I think it's just right now, especially, like I'd ask for peace, and not just peace amongst people, but within oneself as well, so that it's like individual and collective peace.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, that added point of within yourself, I think, is just really, really important for everyone to think about. I think not enough of our current society is conscious of how important peace with yourself is.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's why people do terrible things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you so much for being here. How can people listening support you and your impact?
Yeah, check out my website at madisonmargolin.com and follow me on social media, Instagram, Madison Margolin. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter, but I don't use Twitter as much. It's Margolin Madison there, and you'll just find out about what I'm doing, and I'll let you know. And also, definitely check out Ayin Press, and they're a nonprofit, so if you want to support, it's an option.
Yeah. And I believe by the time this episode publishes, your book will be out, Exile and Ecstasy. We'll be sure to link to it. I'm very much looking forward to reading it. And, thanks again for your time and for being vulnerable with us.
Of course, thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of People Are the Answer. If you enjoyed the episode, share it with friends, and reviews or subscriptions on your favorite platforms go a long way to help the show grow. I want to share these incredible people and their remarkable work with as many others as possible. Thanks for your support. For more, go to peoplearetheanswer.com.